right. It looks like we're live. I've got 13 folks there. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. We started going live on Safari, and my computer was not going to allow that. All right. So this is a live stream to celebrate the channel reaching 15,000 subscribers, for which I'm very thankful. You can ask any questions you like. I will try to get to them all. Welcome, folks. Again, super chats are appreciated, not necessary. I will again answer all questions that come to me. For those of you who are not familiar with the channel, perhaps watching this stream down the road, my name is Keenan Taylor. I am a fantasy writer and scientific illustrator. Chimere is a fantasy project with the map behind me here that is for the books that I write, Tales of Chimere. It is a speculative evolution inspired fantasy setting. So I try to promote a lot of the creatures in the setting on this channel. That's primarily what this channel is. And yeah, I think that about covers the basic introduction. Does anyone have any questions to kick us off? The stream is brought to you by Stock Coffee. They didn't actually sponsor me, but you know, it's brought to you by them anyway. All right. How well are each of the 6 endemic clades of the first dynasty doing? I would say probably the best are the Carbasuchians. They are phylogeny, stem, temnospondyls, and they probably have the highest diversity of any of those clades in the known world. I will be covering quite a bit of that in my Zolani Talk episode that's coming in the middle of March. The Phabodonts and Heterotherms are another pair of clades, and they're doing very well in Kaishel. And the Dynathians are probably just going to be blanket extinct, and the Taurostians are likely to be fairly restricted to the eastern branch of the eastern continent, Kyrule. And that is an environment I will be covering probably, I'm not sure when I will be covering that one. It's been sponsored, an episode on that region of Kyrule, but I have not established a date for it yet. I kind of want that one to come out before the anthology, since I may have an episode at a short story set there, but that story may end up going in the next anthology, which will be having a assembly focus. So to briefly answer your question, the Carbasuchians are doing the best in the known world. The Heterotherms and Phabodonts do both have presence in the known world, but are mostly in regions beyond the known world, and the Dynathians are probably extinct. All right. We getting unicorns. I have a few animals in Chimere that the assembly calls unicorns. The best known of my creations with that term, I think, is probably the Giraffoid unicorn, and that one I think is going to be pretty restricted to the forests of Nikar. What's your favorite aspect of making Chimere? Probably that I made a project in which I can explore all of my interests. I'm very interested in history, science, and illustration, and so this is a setting where if I'm particularly inspired to tell a story that has some political intrigue, I've got quite a few options to explore it. So I think my favorite aspect of making Chimere is the versatility. It's a setting in which I have all of my my special interests incorporated. Have any of the 4 tetrapod lineages in Chimere ever pulled a whale and returned to the ocean? I've got a few secondarily aquatic clades, multituberculates in the central seaway of Kyrule. Um, unless you were talking about the endemic clades, in which case the Carbosuchians have definitely returned to water in the form of the Zolanitok and others that I will be covering in that episode. Um, um, so I've got a couple questions. I'll start off with, how does ranching work in the known world and beyond? So a challenge that farmers in general face in Chimere is that between the flora is generally gymnosperm dominated. A lot of the insects that uh, pollinate a lot of our agriculture is, wait, ranching. That's just animals, isn't it? Well, never mind. Well, I guess it's sort of relevant in that ranching would still necessitate a lot of grain. So I think my original point still stands. Um, there is soil that Chimeran farmers can grow crop on that they would need to feed their livestock, but it is not as abundant as we are used to here on Earth. Um, which is a limiting factor in both the population, because chimerans need an average of twice as much calories as humans do. They have much more demanding metabolisms because of their the magic that extends their lifespan. So they not only need more food, they have less optimal soil on which to grow it, and so that not only impacts the chimerans, it also impacts the livestock that the Chimeran ranchers do be ranching. Do all the first children have wings? So the first children, the wingsuits that I have shown are just that. They're like uh, a suit you might see in a lot more science fiction settings. Um, they're toward the end of their reign, they would do a lot of body modification, and so there certainly would have been some first children that would grow their own wings. But what I usually depict is a external suit that they wear and then can control the wings. And how do draft animals and wagons work in the world? Um, so the chimerans have independently domesticated quite a few different animals, and in some regions like Kajar, um, which is there, Kadan, which is here, and then up in the Empire, have a lot of soil that is conducive to agriculture, and so they have a lot more familiar fauna. So they're going to have the in the Empire they have a lot of horses and water buffalo. In Kajar they have more taurine cattle, um, and then a lot of people have horses as well. In Picardia you have a bit more variety in animals like mastodonts and Leptopterns, so Macrauchenia relative, and those are going to do a lot more um, of the draft animal work. Um, are there any therizinosaurs left in Chimere? That's a question mark right now. I originally had quite a few in the very first map I ever drew of Picardia. I included a therizinosaur, and I believe the second one, which I actually have a copy of and have posted, also had a therizinosaur. So they've been part of the project for a while, but um, I remade the therizinosaur in Picardia to be an oviraptorsaur. Um, and I don't have any other canon therizinosaurs at the moment. Um, so I'm not sure what the final status on that will be. Um, have I already lost my place? There we go. Okay. Um, All right. How do the people of the Free States and Kajarth Republic view each other as brotherly people, rivals? They are both Kadanath, but have different governments and territories. Yes, so they are historically generally viewed as each other's strongest ally. A lot of the nobility of Kajar are um, from the Free States. So a lot of those oligarchical noble families in this island here have gone up there. Sorry, the mirror is difficult to process. Have gone up to Kajar and, through land purchase, become part of the landed gentry. Not all of them. There are a lot of older Kajareth houses that are indigenous, and the peoples themselves, most of them originate from uh, an earlier wave of Kadanath immigration. Some of the Kajareth are indigenous, are Veleth, which is the continent there. So there's, again, historically, they are predominantly viewed as each other's closest allies. They do a lot of trade and alliance in various military contexts. But there's also some tension, especially in kind of the earlier consolidation era, which would correspond to Earth in like the 14 to 1600s. So they haven't always been allies, and there's certainly some remaining tension. But as it stands today, their relations are quite positive. Are there any creatures part of Chimera that are clearly harvested from Earth but lack fossil evidence from Earth? So the ones that first coming to mind are the simiomorph sloths. These are found mostly in Picardia, although there is one that I plan to include right about there. And they are a mylodontoid sloth with a faster metabolism than the two-toed sloth that we're familiar with, which itself has a more active metabolism than the three-toed sloth. And those I haven't given an official answer because I like the idea of the assembly not knowing. But the theory that I'm leading with is that they may well have actually evolved on Earth and come to Chimera. Rainforests are among the habitats that, to my understanding, are extremely unlikely to fossilize. You'll also hear that when people discuss prehistoric mountain biomes. And so rainforests are very poorly sampled. The two-toed and three-toed sloths of Earth, as far as I have found, we have no fossil relatives of them. The only fossil specimens that I could find in my, albeit amateur, search showed that we don't have anything other than a few sort of transitional pre-fossil. So that means like 10,000-year-old Holocene or more recent. So my idea with the simiomorph sloths is, what if there's this whole radiation of arboreal sloths that are a bit more active that we just have no idea if they're present. So that is the answer that comes to mind for that query. Is we don't have any fossils of them, but because the rainforest environment is one that is very unlikely to give us any fossils, I think it would not surprise me if there are a lot of animals in Chimera that are descended from regions for which we have very poor fossilization. That's the explanation I gave for um, the Brontotheres and a few other clades, the names of which are not coming to me because I have so many prehistoric names rattling around in my mind. But this concept that animals in rainforests and mountains might well not be sampled particularly well in our fossil record. So yeah, Are the Kyrulan Megaraptoran species different from the known world? I noticed Ukten art are a little different. Yes. So in Kyrule, there is a genus of animal to which the Ukten of the known world belongs. And are they have presently 4 species. I may end up giving them more. But the Ukten is part of that Kyrulan radiation. They're the one species that came to the known world between half and 250,000 years ago, half a million and 250,000 years ago. So they are different in certainly in comparison to the Zentaur. They're generally a more lightly built animal. Taking the pneumatization that we see in a lot of Megaraptorids and Megaraptorans in general to an extreme. What first inspired the beginning of Chimere? I mean, at its original conception, it was part of a creative writing course that I took when I was 12, in which we were supposed to design an island, design the map of an island, or a fantasy realm, and I chose to draw Picardia right here. In that original conception, it was a island in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle that had elves and dinosaurs, and that core concept remains in the project to this day. So that was when I was 12. I'm 32, so that was a little bit more than 20 years ago. So that was the first inspiration of Chimere. I would say that I've since been quite heavily influenced by the Narnia books, which I was reading at around the time. That kind of is what prompted my idea. The Telmaranes, I believe they were called, was a group of people that came to Narnia and then continued to develop independently. And that concept, I think, is what put in my head, in contrast to Dinotopia, which is another book series that inspired me. But in Dinotopia, those dinosaurs remain the same genera. Some of them have new species, but the same genera as when they were theoretically introduced to this world. And so Narnia is, I think, what put in my head, like, what if the animals that came to Chimere would then evolve independently? That came about. Oh, I think I probably came about a couple years after I had developed the initial concept, but it was before I started to develop the world of Chimere. So probably sometime around, I'm going to say 2006 is when Chimere sort of took the rough shape it's in now. Maybe 2008, somewhere in there. I was not good about putting dates on a lot of my early development, and a lot of them are handwritten, so it's hard to say exactly when each of those steps happened, but yeah. So that's what first inspired Chimere, was a creative writing course that had us draw a map, Narnia, and Dinotopia. How does the portal transfer organic matter between planets? So my idea is that it's not that it is transferring matter directly. It's more like sending an email or a radio transmission. It consumes an organism on one side of the portal, gets all of the compositional data to make a copy, and then the other side of the portal basically 3D prints a copy with such precision that memories are retained. So it's not like a cloning per se. Arguably, I suppose it might be, but it's making a copy. So it's not transferring organic matter. It's using local organic matter to make these replications. So for your episode on magic weapons, how common are they? one for every town, or almost impossible to find. So my idea for this is that it is very rare, and there are very few modern uh, smiths who can make them. So there was a time when they were quite common back during the Age of Witches, which is the uh, third major era in Chimeran history. The first being the Age of the First Children, then the Age of Demons, then the Age of Witches. So that's when most of these enchanted weapons were created. Magical weapons, magic in general, is solar powered. It's photosynthetic. So theoretically, if the weapon was maintained and the magic was perpetuated in sunlight, the weapon could last, and many of these weapons are 10,000 years or more. For the ones that were made by the first children, the Age of Witches was more like 8,000 years ago. So the that might be more recent. Than I would need to brush up on my timeline. It's not something I've thought about for a little while. As for how common they are, with all that in mind, probably pretty rare. That was a plot point in the second of Kirut's stories when he is hunting a demon. To kill a demon, you need an enchanted weapon. And they assembled one more, but it took a while to find and was very expensive. So my idea is that probably there might be maybe a few thousand of them scattered throughout the known world, most of which are going to be family heirlooms, or the Great Library has several hundred in their vaults. Probably are in vaults that have some access to the sun, so that because something that can happen is that if it's in the dark for too long, the magic that enchants it will die, because it's photosynthetic. Um, and so the artifacts that are under lock and key would still need to be given some sun exposure. Um, so yeah, probably not terribly common, certainly not accessible financially to the average person. You're not going to see it in every town, but I would say maybe so closer on the almost impossible to find end of this spectrum. Um, if I may ask, what is the status of extinct chelicerates like euryterids? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm my dyslexia is showing here. And only the euryterids is the clade that I know the name of. I know that euryterids are extinct. Um, and they came to Chimera and did very, very well before it went green. But once the planet did go green, there was a tremendous extinction event in the oceans of Chimera, and euryterids were a casualty of that extinction event. I am sorry, I don't know the other two clades. Um, I have done my darndest to become a expert in trilobites, but I have had a fairly narrow focus in that research just on the clades that I have featured. All right. If the first children revealed themselves to be alive somewhere, either on Chimera or another planet, and they returned to the known world, what would happen? What would the reaction of Chimera and the assembly be? Um, well, I will, without spoiling any plans for future stories, um, it would, I think, largely depend on the context in which they came back. There's a number of uh, factions within Chimera who regard the first children as the bringers of magic, the people who gave them immortality and greatness. And so there would be a perception of reverence to some. Um, Historians largely would be very nervous about them having any information about what the real history of the first children would be like. But I think that the interpretations of the first children vary wildly between both the assembly and within chimerans. So it I think there would be a very mixed reaction, but no matter positive or negative, uh, it would be very impactful if they were to return. Um, all right, Sam. Hey, how's it going? How do you feel about fan theories? Are you all right with people publicly speculating about things that you haven't gone or won't go public with on platforms such as Reddit or Discord? I love it. I mean, I've got a basic outline for my own plans for how this series is going to go. I've got 8 books that have kind of a rough layout. Um, I've written most of them, but my God, am I going to have to rewrite them because a lot of them are very rough. They're not bad. They're just I have improved a lot as a writer, even just in the short time between writing the first and second anthology. So my plan is to revisit those, but the basic concept is all laid out. As far as fan theories go, I love it. I love it. All on board. Um, when did you come up with the Fabadonts? I think my earliest concept of them was that would be probably it was definitely while I was in undergrad. So maybe 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. And my initial concept of them was just having a funny idea that they would be named after something like the shape of their teeth, but being one of the weirdest creatures in Chimere. They don't look exactly like they did back then. I think initially they were Dicynodonts. Um, I've pushed them back further to um, explore their anatomy in weirder ways. But yeah, when did I come up with them? I think probably around 2011, 2012 as the initial concept. As they are today, that was much more recent, probably within the past few years, is when I finalized them into what I presented in the first Dynasty episode at the beginning of 2024. Um, in most isolated regions we visit beyond the known world, we see human natives in them. Is there any place where Scryi are the dominant Sophonts other than the region of Kyrule we met them in? Presently, that is not my plan, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. The Scryi are able to get by on a much leaner diet and have a lot more versatility in making ends meet. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are in other regions of Kyrule where humans just haven't really established themselves. They would not be the Scry. That is specifically the language and culture in which the assembly first met them. So they would have a distinct language and culture wherever I end up making them. But generally, um, humans are a more aggressive and prolific type of sophont than the others we that are in Chimere. And so I don't plan on the Scry and other sophonts being kind of on that level of um, conquest and dominance that we see in humans. Um, Are there any Carcharodontosaurs left? So I have a plan for a at least 3, possibly 4 species of Ceridens, which is a descendant of a group of Carcharodontosaurs, probably not Carcharodontosaurids proper. Um, but again, these are just names we make up to describe things, but like somewhere in that end of the Carnosaur lineage. So probably not true Carcharodontosaurids; those are likely extinct. But the greater Ceridens is morphologically broad strokes. It's just a Giganotosaurus type animal. Um, So those are going to be present in eastern Kyrule, and possibly north of the hemisphere for one species, but I'm still debating about that. Um, are we getting the last of the protosauropods in the southern continent? So my plan for uh, so for those who don't know, prosauropod is not a technical grouping. Protosauropod is the term you used, and I think that's a perfectly serviceable term. Prosauropod was more familiar in the dinosaur books I had growing up. We now know that that's uh, more of what is called a grade, and so it's not like it's the prosauropods were a specific family. It's more a step that the sauropodomorphs took, and then one of those lineages went on to become the true sauropods. So phylogenetically speaking, technically sauropods are prosauropods, which is why that's no longer. Anyway, so I do have at least one lineage of what historically would have been called prosauropods, which I named parasauropods, which are in Kyshel, which is the southern continent, as you mentioned. So that's one of the last of them. I may have some in Kyrule and a few other regions beyond the known world. That's something I'm still kind of in debate about. Um, how is the Nehamu doing since last you talked about them? Um, so the Nehamu is the last tyrannosaur of Chimere. Um, I'm having some debates about them because there's a part of me that wants to put them in Kyrule, because having them be so very far from where, because right now they're in Arvel, which is kind of in this area along these Appalachian mountain analog areas, um, and that's presently where they are. Um, that would have necessitated a lot of travel from where they likely were relics of. I may end up moving them at least to northern Nikar here, up to the tippy top of that continent, or perhaps somewhere in Kyrule, which would mean a name change because Nehamu is. Actually, I would need to look. The Nehamu might be an Arvelith word, but it might be the Kadjarth word for them. And if that's the case, then I wouldn't need to change the name. So I would need to look over my Kadjarth document to see if that's where the etymology came from. Because I would like to keep the name if I can, but I may be moving them. So how is the Nehamu doing since last we talked about it? That's kind of where I roughly stand now. Is it the basic animal is going to stay the same, and their connection to being the last tyrant, I may alter their design a little bit, but in broad strokes, they're still going to be there. They're still going to be in Chimere. I just may move where they are. They might be in northern Nakar or in over in Kyrule. What are Lepidopterans like in Chimere? I'm going to have to look that up because I confess I don't know what that is. Oh, Lamau. Okay, butterflies. Um, they're doing well. They're probably not doing exceptionally well, I would guess, um, because there are flowering plants throughout the known world. Especially, there's more than in other regions of Chimere. So I would imagine that, kind of like bees, they are doing pretty well in the known world, but they may not have the cosmopolitan distribution that you might expect. Um, so overall, in the stories that are set in the known world, there are plenty of Lepidopterans there. Um, What real-world ecosystems have particularly inspired those in Chimere? The inland sea is such a unique idea and is so essential to the known world. Would love to know what inspired it. So when I was in late high school, I took a trip to the Everglades as part of their, I believe it was part of their study abroad program. I live in North America, so in the US, so it's not like technically studying abroad, but I digress. So I took a program there for a couple weeks, um, and a lot of the ecosystems that we traveled through there were very inspirational to Chimere. Um, I've always been a hiker and one who likes walking around outdoors, um, but mostly we've been in the northern U.S. Um, and so that was a very different environment for me. It's closer to the sort of hothouse environment that inspired me. And so when we did a canoe trip in a seagrass meadow, that was certainly what inspired that particular environment in Chimera, and thinking like, okay, what if the context in which a seagrass meadow can evolve here on Earth, which is like very shallow seas, what if that spanned between two continents? Was kind of my original conception of that, coupled with over the years reading that like in periods of Earth history past when the sea levels were higher, there was a lot more of that shallow seaway along continental shelves that may have supported more seagrass meadows. So Chimera is a hotter planet compared to Earth, and so my idea was like, well, what if this whole span that in if Chimere were as cold as Earth is today, or a century ago at the very least, much of the inland sea would be lowland terrestrial environment. Um, and so it's very contextual to the known world, to Chimere as it is today. So that was inspirational for that. When I was in grad school in Washington State, and also in just periodically, there's a camp that I go to a bunch in the Adirondacks. Those were more inspirational to how I present um, Kajar and Picardia and the Kaleen Islands, which is this verdant, temperate rainforest. It's just an environment that I've grown up around and am very affectionate toward. So those I would say are some of the real world inspirations. Generally, I read about stuff because I've done a lot more reading than I have traveling. But I do try to go to some of these places that inspire regions in Chimere so that I can get familiar with and inspired by them. Do the Chimeran trolls look like Zentaur, Kurojaku, or any of the other massive megathyropods, or do they all have a muted gray tone? I haven't decided yet. It kind of depends on what their um, divergent components are. I do have an episode on the trolls that's been sponsored, specifically a sea troll, and that one will likely have Kurojaku inspiration in its coloration. Um, but yeah, overall, I'm not sure about their coloration yet. Sorry. I want to, just in general, I try to keep. I have concepts long before I execute them, and it can. I try not to limit myself until I'm actually at the drawing board and designing them, if that makes sense. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, and I'm sorry for that, but the simple answer is I'm not sure yet. Um, all right. Question for the first dynasty. You had formerly said Carbosuchians were the least diverse compared to Phabodonts and Heterotherms. What made you change your mind? Um, well, my original conception was that there would be a group of temnospondyls which outcompeted the Carbosuchians. But as I've been doing more studying and revision, I have lumped a lot of those old Temnospondyls into Carbosuchia. The main reason for that is that I was under the impression that Temnospondyls were much more ancient than they are, with an asterisk that they might actually go well back, which will tie into the phylogeny segment that I have for Carbosuchians in the Zolanitalk episode. But in short, I said that Carbosuchians were the least diverse. What changed my mind is the reclassification of a lot of animals that I had as Temnospondyls into Carbosuchia. Congrats on 50K. Thank you very much. If you had to pick a favorite animal from your setting, what would it be? That would be Indrikai. Perhaps it's just that it was the first speculative evolution animal that I ever created. I'm not sure when exactly it was made, but it was for Chimere. It's on the first map of Picardia. I think at that point it fluctuated between a new species of Deinonychus and a species of giant Archaeopteryx, or Archaeopteryx. I'm not sure if there's a formal pronunciation for that, but whatever. If you had to, so if I had to pick a favorite animal for my setting, it would be Indrikai, just for my own nostalgia, I would say. So question one, are you still doing scientific illustrations, or are you now a pure writer and working on YouTube? And what made you decide to make bears so much less diverse in Chimere? Two great questions. Yes, I still do some scientific illustrations. Most of what I do are private commissions. I do a lot of birds. I do a lot of local fauna. I've done a fair bit of work in uh, local New York wildlife and Pennsylvania wildlife. I have not done museum or textbook or national park art in, it's been a few years since I've gotten one of those gigs. I'm not really putting myself out there for it these days, though. So that's certainly on me. Um, I would love to try to do more of those. The unfortunate simple reality is a lot of those gigs that I was getting were just, they don't have much of a budget for art, and I needed to prioritize things that helped me pay the rent. I am doing better now, and that's something I plan on start doing. Is I want to start reaching out to these programs more and basically doing accepting gigs that only have a $50 budget or no budget. I think it's important to support your local scientific communities, and that's something I do intend to start doing more of in the coming months. Um, so yes, I still do some scientific illustrations, but it is certainly not as much as I did early on in my career. And why did you decide to make bears so much less diverse in Chimere? I don't think it was a intentional decision so much as once I determined that sloths were doing really well, and I was having a major radiation of the omnivorous sloths that felt like they would be very competitive with bears. Um, I felt that that it would make sense that only one of them would really excel, and I decided to make it sloths, largely based on a conversation I had with a paleontologist who said that it's entirely possible that Mylodonts specifically would have been pretty competitive with them. And playing into the idea that a lot of what I explore in Chimere is challenging what is a pervasive assumption in a lot of my experience, that what we see today is inevitable. And so I think that sloths are, they seem to do very poorly in human dominated environments. Um, but I think it's easy to forget that in the absence of humans, there were, to my understanding, like 3 or 4 times as many sloth species in the Americas than bears had globally. Um, and so that was kind of my impetus for that decision was if these two clades are directly competing, generally there is a trend for one of them to be dominant. It happened to be bears on Earth compared to the more omnivorous mylodonts, but I don't think that that was inevitable. So I don't hate bears. I didn't mean to give them such a hard time in Chimere, but that was, I think, just a consequence of trying to balance a very messy ecosystem that's constantly getting new harvests and competitions, trying to strive for a balance there. And it felt to me that it wasn't unreasonable that omnivorous sloths might have been made life in Chimera a harder time for some bears. Um, do you think there was a possibility for that the species of Pacific mastodon from the interrupted harvest that was able to breed with mastodons from Picardia? No. So the harvest that introduced mastodon of the latest Pleistocene, early Holocene to Chimere would have been restricted to Kajar. Um, and I don't believe the Pacific mastodon, which I know I've heard talk that they had a wider range than was originally proposed, but I still don't believe they were getting to the East Coast, which is where the interrupted harvest was mostly localized. And even if it was, I am skeptical that they would have been able to hybridize, even if they were put on Picardy, which they weren't. Um, the Picardian mastodon is at least taken from North America 8 million years ago, and possibly a much earlier radiation. That's something I'm not planning on establishing firmly in the episode, but generally speaking, and I may iron that out once I start doing some of the prehistoric mastodon art. Um, but they would not have been able to breed with the mastodons from Picardy, I imagine. Um, Asian and African elephants are have only had one that I know of hybrid that even survived to birth, and it didn't make it more than a week. So it is my understanding that those two elephant lineages are as much as half the distance back in time. Um, now, hybridization is not a hard and fast rule. Different clades have different compatibilities, but I am skeptical that um, that would have been viable. Um, about the Jugelhorn aspect, which was a sensible thing for the Zentaur saga? Did the scientific paper about it, has it been published? If so, what was the results? What are supposedly the problems? Um, I it is not yet published. Um, uh, I to my understanding, the results have been publicly discussed. But I am not 100% sure about that, so I don't want to break embargo if they are not yet public. I know it's not published yet. Once it is, that's something I may well do an episode about, to answer some of the confusion, but I don't want to break embargo, so I'm not in a position to answer that yet, unfortunately. Um, Against such traits in theropods, while we have it in ceratopsians, and what that would mean for Megaraptorans and Chimera. Also, why did you initially give them this trait at first? Oh, so this is just further discussion on the Jugelhorns. Um, it's I don't know um what that trait would be. So it's I don't know um how I will execute that in ceratopsians. It is all dependent on when this paper comes out and being able to actually read it and discuss it publicly. Um, what holidays do chimerans celebrate? I have a few concepts for them, but I will freely confess that a lot of these were developed very early on and are probably subject to change. Um, a lot of them are just basically I wrote them in as placeholders with the intention of fleshing them out later. Um, some of them are harvest festivals. Some of them are celebrating military memorials. So those are probably all going to stay, but I don't have a full list yet. Um, all right, next question is, do any of the non-hominin sophonts of Chimere have animals that they have independently domesticated? If so, how do these domesticates help them in ways they couldn't help human relatives? So that is a general trend that I am avoiding for non-human sophonts. It's something that I plan on developing and exploring more. So it's not a hard and set rule, but my general thought is that domestication is going to be the purview of hominin sophonts. Um, it's something that that's not something that I'm saying there are no non-human sophonts that domesticate other animals, but that is something that I'm planning on largely, if not exclusively, attributing to human species. Um, what inspired you to make the Entelodonts vocal mimics, and how feasible is that for mammalian vocal cords? What inspired it is easy. There is a creature in Dungeons and Dragons and in folklore of, I believe, ancient Greece. Um, was it? It may have been Pliny who discussed them. Not 100% sure on that off the top of my head. The Leucrota is a creature in folklore that was also, again, I was exposed to it first in Dungeons and Dragons, which is a hyena-like hoofed animal that mimics human voices. So that's what inspired the Entelodonts having this vocal mimicry. Um, how feasible is it? How plausible is it? Uh, not very, most likely. I tend not to restrict myself only to the most plausible options. I think that's what you should do if you're doing a rigorous conservative reconstruction. If Chimere were supposed to be if I were reconstructing Entelodonts for a novella meant to portray a real Entelodont in prehistory, like Archaeotherium, this is not a trait that I would give them. I think it's plausible, but certainly not likely. It is certainly one of my more speculative, non-grounded traits that I've given these animals. But that's what assigned it. What inspired it was I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons in high school, um, and I really liked to be creative and weird with some of the animals, and so I had an encounter that I was leading with my friends, in which I was the dungeon master and having them encounter Leucrota, and I leaned into that idea of I had so much fun having it articulate with the players, and early in the mission they were hearing children crying out, and local villagers calling out for help, trying to lure them out. And so that's what inspired um the Intelladon mimics. um and I think the execution was further inspired by uh, the scene in Annihilation with the bear that had consumed a person, and had part of her voice pattern in it. I wouldn't say that's what inspired it at all. That the concept of the Leo Crota is again one that I had met long before and given to the Intelladons, but I think that was mostly just, it was less inspirational and more, oh, this is how that concept could be well executed, and I want to keep this in mind as like gold standard for the creepy execution of this concept. um I lost my place again. Um Sorry folks, I lost my place and I'm trying to make sure that I get an answer to all of these. Um, oh goodness, I scrolled way down. Um, I've heard you say Eurytrids went extinct from the greening of Chimera, which makes sense, but the Eurytrids came around afterwards. It's not like they had gone extinct yet on Earth. That is true. But my understanding is that they were mostly freshwater Eurytrids. And I don't think that they didn't go extinct at that point, and there may have been a few marine ones. But by the major ice age in the middle of the Jurassic dynasty, Eurytrids were extinct on Chimera. So that is my the rationale for my decision there. Um, all right, I think I need to start giving briefer answers because I'm scrolling up and I am I did not get to any of these. My goodness. Okay, all right. Let's start picking up the pace. Um, oh goodness. I am so sorry, folks. All right. Three, how did you manage to make the various cultures of Chimera without basing them too much out of real cultures? So this was largely what I was doing in undergrad. I started off as a biology major, but I turned my focus more to anthropology. I still did a lot of biology courses. Was just trying to get as broad an understanding of human cultures as I could. And my intention and approach is to try and have the foundations of my cultures be as common denominator as possible. So for the Picardian, for example, which is the society that I would say I've done, I it was the earliest one that I'd done the most development on. Their culture was very much inspired by other peoples that have lived in this sort of environment and are somewhat insular. Not necessarily, but generally. So the Haudenosaunee, the the British Isles pre-Roman, um, Japan, these are looking at these various cultures, seeing what they have in common, seeing trends that tend to pop up in these disparate societies that don't derive from each other but have come to similar solutions, because people are smart, and generally there's a lot of different ways you can do things, but oftentimes there is a best way to do them. Waste disposal sewer systems often independently come to a similar uh, presentation, a similar execution. The bow and arrow appears to have developed as many as three different times in human history, although there's a bit of an asterisk there. It could well be that we just haven't found, what the Andaman Islanders and the North American indigenous Americans origin of them. It may just have an African origin that we just haven't. But the point being that it seems like humans do independently come to a lot of the same conclusions, and so that's something that I keep in mind with my Chimeran cultures is really trying to, if there is something that is found in every temperate islander culture, I'll give it to the Picardiant. If the pre-Roman Irish, the Japanese, and uh, the Maori all came up with a similar solution to a problem, that's something I'll give to the Picardiant. There is also um, trade and influence that further impacts cultures. The archery in Picardia, for example, is something that I have them taking influence from imperial archery traditions. So it's how do you manage to make various cultures without basing them off too much of real cultures? Is I'm trying to look for common denominators as my basic starting point. Um, I hope that was helpful and not too rambly. Um, what place on Earth would you compare the Kenterim Islands to? Um, so I would say probably. That one's hard to say. I think I took a lot of Caribbean influence for them. Um, a lot of that being derivative from my mother, who spent much of her childhood in Barbados. And so there's a lot of inspiration from my brief time in the Caribbean and hearing stories from my mother. But there's not like a specific place that inspired them. But that might be the closest comparison, would be islands in the Caribbean. Um, what's the most important Chimeran creature you've never drawn or sketched publicly? Oh, honestly, I'm sorry, nothing's coming to mind. Um, I mean, I've okay, I've got something that came to mind. So there is a sloth in Qajar that is descended from either similar to or part of Megalonyx that I will be including in the episode on Qajar as it was prior to the first children. This animal was the result of the interrupted harvest, so that does change a little bit of the lore I stated about the alligator being the largest animal. Although maybe not. Maybe alligators exceed a ton in Qajar. I would need to I imagine this is going to slightly revise the lore a little bit, but longtime fans will know that's never really stopped me. Any chance of some first children to return and getting into conflicts with modern day chimerans? Um, any chance? There's a chance. There's a chance. Has anyone ever tried to domesticate or tame a titan? Has anyone ever tried with a silent one? Yeah, don't definitely. I mean, humans love to try. So I would say yes, there have been attempts to tame both of those animals. Um, Neither have been successful. Will one of the Beyond the Known World stories take place in the Crown of Hyrule? No. Um, at least not for this anthology. There may be some um, for future stories. Um, I do have quite a few more anthologies planned along with the novel series. Um, is there a possibility that some of the megafauna from the interrupted harvest survive in Picardia, or is that too far that they have simply drowned or were killed off by the hands of the first children? Um, Picardia was beyond where the harvest occurred. It was very localized on Kajar. Some animals did swim away. That is where raccoons of some of the islands around here came from. They hopped off of and swam too. Um, Nothing in Picardia planned at the moment, though. Aside from humans, what would you say is the political dynamic between the Empire and the Republic? They seem to be consolidated in their own natural territories, but it was mentioned that the Three Spears War that they still fight. So there was the dynamic between them is one of a bit of a Cold War inspired conflict. They don't actively engage with one another, but they do pay pirates to attack each other. They do have proxy wars that they each fund. Um, the Three Spears was a conflict that took place in Picardia, um, and it was over logging rights. And the Empire and Republic and Picardia had sort of a three-way conflict. And it culminated in the peoples of the Free States facilitating a treaty which effectively has been more or less held to this day. Um, the Three Spears was a conflict that was extremely high in casualties, and that is not common for Chimeran warfare. Typically, Chimeran warfare um, is more uh, is more about taking territory than killing. Um, but and so that's yeah. So it was a very bloody fight that they came together and agreed um, that they were not going to do that again. Um, Again, wars still happen. There's still been plenty of conflict. But generally, the four major factions uh, in Chimere have been at peace since that conflict. So the political dynamic between Empire and Republic is peaceful, but they are certainly in proxy engagements with one another, funding ways to impede the other's progress. Is there any life in Chimere that was harvested from places other than Earth? If so, are they still alive or have they gone extinct? Maybe. It is something that I need to develop these other planets um, before I can develop the. I need to develop them before I can apply them to um, this project. None of them are going to be megafauna. Most of them are probably extinct. Um, Chimere, the reason that Earth life succeeded on Chimere was because it had a very similar atmosphere and gravity. Um, Organisms taken from other planets were not successful largely because they came from planets that were incompatible. Um, what sort of animals are most abundant in the crown of Kyrule? That is presently a bit of a question mark. I'm not sure yet. Um, I have a basic idea, but I don't want to answer and then change it because it's a region that I'm still very much in development for. It's going to be predominantly, if not exclusively, dinosaurs as the megafauna. If that much I can't say. Um, Hi, Keenan. Thank you for your work. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed. How do humans actually survive on Chimera day to day, considering just how many highly aggressive giant predators exist and the lack of high tech weaponry? Um, Predominantly, it's because they live in these areas which are generally depauperate of dangerous animals. Um, Humans, even with a spear, are extremely dangerous animals. Um, and we have chimerans have driven a lot of dangerous animals in their settled areas to extinction. Um, and so the lowlands of Picardia, which is kind of this area here, does not have as many giant dangerous animals as you find up in the highlands. Kajar has a big wall keeping away a lot of the dangerous animals, um, and the largely cliff-based coast means that it's fairly terrestrially isolated. And the top predator of Kajar is a lion, which is something that humans have historically, yes, they're dangerous, but we have plenty of ways of dealing with lions before firearms. Um, so that's how is they do it by living generally in areas where a lot of these dangerous animals have been hunted to extinction. Are there any Oreodonts in Chimere, given how diverse, numerous, widespread, and successful they were in Oligocene North America? Probably. They're likely going to be present quite abundantly in Kyrule. Um, Probably going to be mostly smaller animals, but um, that is my intention. Um, have you ever seen that Chimeran Jersey Devil I did? That doesn't sound familiar. If you could email that to me, that sounds very cool. Um, talesofchimera@gmail.com. Probably the most efficient way to do it. Hey, Keenan, love to see more of you. You've been doing a huge, you are a huge spark of inspiration, especially for the worlds I'm working on. Mad respect to you. Thank you very much. I love to hear that I'm part of the chain of inspiration. Um, um, are there sports that include animals like bullfighting or horse racing? Um, there definitely will be. I have not, similar to a lot of other aspects of the human cultures, I have written in stories the basic concepts of some different games and sports, but I don't have a lot of them finalized yet. A lot of them still subject to change. So sorry, that is not one I can give a satisfactory answer to. Um, what made you get into world building and prehistory? It's just always been my interest. I have always loved creative writing, even if I was very late to the reading and writing party. I struggled a lot with learning a lot of the foundations, so I didn't get into it very quickly. But I've always loved storytelling and prehistory. My first word was fossil, so this is just it's always been there. Um, Fossa was, I think, the exact word that I used. Fossil itself was a bit beyond my capabilities at however young I was. Um, do you imagine something like Uteranus on Chimere, analog or convergent? Well, the announcement of Uteranus was very influential to the development of what are now my Megaraptorans. A lot of my art from college onward, because I believe that was announced in 2012, and so that was very inspirational in how I depicted my megatheropods. Prior to that, they were usually some variation of Carcharodontosaur. And after Yutyrannus was announced, they were all the Enyedord group was all descendants of Yutyrannus. So very inspirational and analog, and the Oritaku it's basically Yutyrannus, even if it's not phylogenetically Yutyrannus. How can magic enchant metal weapons when it needs living things to inhabit? Would be cool if the more powerful magic weapons just resemble wooden staves, but with some living leaves. So typically, part of the enchantment process is giving your weapon places for the magic to live. Now, magic is very small; it's microscopic. So often there are perforations along sturdy parts. When I was designing the sword that Elijah uses, for example, along the spine of the sword are a bunch of the texture is very pocketed. I mean, these are microscopic pockets, but it basically allows the magic to have a place to be stored. And when it's ready to strike or needs to be repaired, the magic can come out of that of those perforations and do what they need to do. There are certainly older enchanted weapons that are mostly made of wood. The club that the chieftain uses in my second Kirut story here in the second anthology, that one is made of wood, and it is described as kind of like feeling like living wood, and it's that's why is that there is magic living throughout it. Do you have any ideas for the fauna on the Arctic continent? Yes, I have ideas. Have I executed them such that I can describe them in public yet? No. What about video about the laws, authorities, and sanctions of various Chimeran cultures be interesting? The first anthology, there is a criminal woman speaking with Indrikai. Yes, I mean, very interesting. I have a lot about the criminal justice system in my own notes. So that is certainly something that I would want to revisit and polish up before I publish it. I would have a lot of fun making that sort of episode. I don't know how interested a lot of my established fan base would be, but I don't know. It might play well. Um, how come hadrosaurs failed to rediversify? I remember reading that their food processing was so efficient that they could handle basically all vegetation. I assume to allow for different animal groups. I mean, yes, on a meta level, absolutely. If hadrosaurs had rebounded, Fiskellosaurs and Elasmarians would not have been able to radiate into those niches then left absent. They wouldn't have been able to get big, and probably most of the mammal groups would have also not had a chance. It would have maybe been an interesting project to explore mammals coming in, because as it is right now, mammals came into the known world and we're kind of on a level playing field because the Thescelosaurs and Elasmarians, which were the numerically dominant herbivores in those first million or 2 years following the dynastic extinction, they were coming in at a very competitive way, and mammals were often some of the largest herbivores. If hadrosaurs had survived, the known world would be a very different place. Thescelosaurs and Elasmarians probably would still be quite small, and the mammal megafauna diversity would be much lower. In universe, I've explained that hadrosaurs were hit so hard because they were extremely dominant and tied to the context in which went away, and so the specialization that they had was their undoing. Is that realistic? I don't know. I think it's quite likely that there would have been some species of more generalist hadrosaurs on the fringes. Maybe it's not realistic. I think that's a fair critique to levy at much of my work, is that I don't always take the most plausible route. I would say that I don't think that that makes Chimere unrealistic. Animals don't always succeed in the most likely of ways. So I don't think it's a flaw of the project, but I think it's fair to say that it is more likely that hadrosaurs, if they had survived in any capacity, and maybe that's a problem with the Gurkhan. Um, I don't know. I think it's a fair question to posit and consider. Um, Ultimately, that's the reason I did it, was that if hadrosaurs survived, they they would be the dominant herbivores. Um, I think Alamosaurus is a testament to the fact that sauropods could have been just fine even in hadrosaur dominant environments, not to mention that they were still doing just fine in Asia toward the Maastrichtian. But that's kind of my thoughts on hadrosaurs and Chimere. I think, yeah, it's fair to say they probably should have been dominant, but I wanted to explore other clades, and that meant giving them the boot. How do the Picardiant operate? Do they have territorial ambitions on the spine, or still wild in areas of the island? So the spine, which is southern Picardia, but still kind of in the north, that is a region where there are a bunch of unified clans. That was actually the earliest confederacy. Was a bunch of clans coming together and having a united government. That was before the Confederacy, which now operates throughout that part of the island up there up top. Do they have territorial ambitions? Um, I'm sure there are some who do, but generally they have uh, a lot of soil in the south, in the north, yeah, the northeast part of the island, that is very compatible to the agriculture, and the highlands are not compatible to their agriculture. So there probably isn't much ambition to expand the highlands. Um, and a big part of their culture is that the Picardiant are extremely conservative. Um, and the majority religion is very much built around the island. So if you die, your body should be returned to the island. They can loan themselves or their lumber out to, and this was a big source of tension during the Three Spears, was they were fine with giving away lumber, and some factions were happy to do so and didn't care about the religion, but a lot of the factions were only okay with the lumber leaving the island on the understanding that when the ship had completed its service, that the lumber would be returned so that it could return to the island. So this is a very conservative people who view their island as a very intrinsic part of their identity. So they're not looking to expand to other territories, um, because that would again involve leaving their island. Do they plan on? Does the faction of the Picardian Confederacy plan to expand up into the Highlands? Again, I'm sure there are some who would like to, but the practicality of that is difficult. The lowlands are where you can get good farming in. The highlands, agriculture would be very difficult. And there are people and non-human sophonts up in the highlands um, who you would be in conflict with if you tried to do that. Has that ever stopped humans? No. But it is a further challenge, is that agriculture is very poor up there in the highlands, and there's already people there who would give them a hard time doing it. Um, what culture do the Chimeran merfolk have, and do any group of humans try to make an alliance with them? The Kentarim have a long-standing alliance with them. Their culture has I haven't done a tremendous amount of work on their culture. They're one of my factions where I developed enough of their culture to tell their story, um, at least in brief. But I don't have a tremendous amount on their culture yet finalized. Just a lot of concepts. Um, are there any sloths in Kyrule? Probably not. I had originally had this concept of the Hukelgor island hopping its way over there, but in my revisions on them and further restricting their range, they would get cooked alive if they tried to go the equatorial route. And now Kyrule is further east than it used to be earlier in the project's development. So I now no longer think that's especially viable. Um, how do the fully terrestrial amblyopicthians reproduce? I don't know. I have not finalized that. Will we ever get a Turtlehead episode? And then will there be further mention of the four clades of Pachycephalosaur? None is sponsored yet. And I don't have any plans for them in the immediate next anthology being included, although there's one story that they might be. But I don't have any plans of them as of yet. Have you ever talked about monotremes in your setting? Are they more or less widespread in Chimere compared to Earth? There are a couple monotremes in Chimere, but they are all known world or nearby. My plan is that they went extinct in Chimere and have only been reintroduced in recent history. There's a couple possible exceptions to that, but I'm not quite sure yet. I just want to say how much I appreciate the tone here not being a gatekeeping sort of performative intellectualism and is instead sincere and wholesome nerdery. Well done, all. Thank you so much. Yeah, I like the questions we're getting, and I'm my intellectual interests are way too spread thin and generalists for me to pull off being too intellectual. So I couldn't land that if I tried. But yes, thank you. Would it be possible for the Ushalek, which is, for those who don't know, is a jungle ecosystem that is one of the uh, gods, and the gods are kind of like the portal. That it's a massive collection of this magic concentrated in a single entity. And this particular one is very abhorrent of fauna and generally tries to keep most of the uh, organisms in this territory um, to be either plants or animals that directly assist in the flora. Um, would it be possible for the Ushalek to infect wide-ranging animals to spread more of itself across the continent? So a aspect of these gods is that their territories are generally restricted. Something that is very special and weird and unique about the Rahar, which is the portal that kind of encompasses this area here above me. That's weird in that it has a satellite that is very far. Generally, these gods, as they're sometimes called, have a fairly restricted range. Um, and so it could spread further, but the reason it hasn't is the mountains make the other side of the range that the Ushalek occupies very arid, and it is very plant focused and likes being along this equatorial coast, which is not in the map above me. I'm sorry, folks, but that coast is perfect for a dense, lush tropical jungle that the Ushalek occupies. Um, and so it's possible to infect and spread further, but that is not likely to happen. Um, for the challenges of communicating with its territory too far apart. Um, Given the apparent tech level of your world, is there an aquarium pet trade in it, given how difficult it can be to create large panes of clear glass? If yes, what would be the popular pets? I imagine it is possible, but it would certainly be a luxury um, sort of thing. You might see them in very wealthy parts of the empire and perhaps the very wealthy southern Qajar and then the free states there. So you might see a few of them, but again, in terms of modern economy, probably because these are all handmade and would have to be imported likely from a few um, areas of expertise, likely within the free states. Um, these are going to be extremely expensive luxury items. As for what popular pets are, I think that really just depends on. I would imagine that trilobites and ammonites are quite popular because a lot of them have these very pretty iridescent shells that I've designed. Um, and both of them would be fairly easy to keep. Um, the ammonites in particular, there's a pair of clades that basically do their water filtration for you. So that would, I imagine, be very popular as pets. And thank you very much for the super chat there. I appreciate it. Um, if lamias were to exist in Chimere, how would they work? P.S. Mad respect for you. You're awesome, man, and your why I strive to be the best of the best. Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words. Um, I confess, when I hear Lamia, I think of the D&D monster, which, as I understand it, is very different from the mythical one. The one in mythology is a similar to Naga's, where it's like a centaur sort of person on a head, snake below, but I may be misremembering. Um, if that's the case, then that would certainly be a first children creation. And I basically have one in the form of a character whose name escapes me in the mermaid story that I told in the second anthology, who is a uh, merman who has the bottom half of a very long, slender mosasaur, Katabo. Um, so he, I think, would probably be the closest thing that I have as canon for a Lamia. But if I'm misremembering and it's something else, then I'm sorry for that mistake. That's one thing I'm curious of. Their Utranus. Yep. Um, could the assembly collaborate with the Great Library and use that as a workaround for some of their restrictions, i.e., is the Great Library expeditions helpful to the assembly? That is how, especially in the past century, a lot of the assembly has accomplished their studies. Um, Basically, the Great Library can bring in human consultants who come on missions, but again, even that often requires authorization. Um, but some of them have that as a means of workaround. It just means that they then need to abide by the standards and protocols of the Great Library, which they already do. They're both um, very cautious intellectual organizations. Are the Jackals of Chimere a part of Canis or Lupulela? I confess I don't know that genus. Um, and are the wolves of Chimere descended from these jackals, or are they closer to true wolves? So, from what I remember from study and execution of my Wild Dogs of Chimere episode, they are in the genus Canis. Um, and my thought was that they are, Canis is in our own world a very adaptable and very prone to hybridization species. So my idea was that even if they were taken in 2 or 3 different harvests, a lot of them would be able to integrate quite readily. Um, um, I envision them being closer to true wolves, but they are not in the species Canis lupus. The specifics of what counts as a true wolf and what is included in the species of wolves and how many wolf species there are is, as I understand it, a matter of considerable debate. Um, and the animals that we know of that are true wolves, Canis lupus, I believe evolved half a million years ago, possibly slightly earlier. Um, if memory serves, again, this is not something I've read up on in like 2 years. Um, and I don't know what the current literature is, so I don't want to I don't want to spread misinformation or come off like I know what I'm talking about because I don't. That is my understanding is that the jackals of Chimere are closer to true wolves, but that true wolves were probably never harvested in Chimere, with the possible asterisks of the interrupted harvest in latest Pleistocene, early Holocene North America. Are those true wolves? I understand that is also a matter of some debate and don't want to make any conclusive statements on. Sorry for the rambling there. I just, again, I really, it is important to me to not present myself as an authority on these matters because I am not. Um, how good are monitor lizards doing in Chimera? In the known world, very well. I have, I think, 17 species of Varanus, but again, a lot of that's subject to change. Um, See above question about what is a species. Um, I have a episode on the Moduru, which is the largest monitor lizard species, and that one's coming out, I believe, early summer. Um, and I will be doing a deep dive in Varanus research and execution of some of those designs. Then it's a species focus episode, so it's not going to be a lot on the clade overall, but I will be touching on them. Um, uh, are there any other forest rachids left beyond the known world? Probably not. The Bathornithids, which are, as I understand it, forest rachid analogs. The relationship last I read up on them was that they are probably a sister clade, but that is not consensus to my understanding. That may have changed. I may be misremembering. So many different things rattling around upstairs here. So probably not, but the Bathornithids are going to be present in Kyrule, and they are broad strokes. You would look at it and say, "Oh, that's a terror bird." So it's a very similar animal. Do you plan on doing a video of the surviving relics of the first dynasty? Yes, that one has already been sponsored. It will probably be in. I'm not sure when. I haven't set a date for it yet, so I don't want to say anything now and then oops, I was wrong. Are there any chameleons in Chimere? I remember in the anthology Haunted Legacy, one character mentions this group as potential material for the Silent Ones when they're thinking about homunculi. Yes, so they are indeed present. I don't have any canon species yet. Um, I just know that they're probably going to be present, but it's not a group that I've studied, so I don't know when did they evolve, what is their range in coinciding with harvests. So I assume that they are eligible for harvest. It's not a radiation within the past 10,000 years that has just erupted across the world. So it's one that I know that there are likely options, and they're probably going to be present, likely in northern Arvel and Nikar. But again, I don't want to make any conclusive statements on them until I've taken some time to study them. Um, are there any organisms that were harvested from planets other than Earth? Oh, yes. I've answered that one. And I appreciate people um, putting your questions in again. I'm trying to get to them all, but my chat bar keeps refreshing, and so if I gloss over them, please. I'm not trying to. I am not attempting to swindle or ignore any of you. I just if it refreshes, it's hard to get back to where I was. What is the Crown of Hyrule like? As I mentioned previously, it's one that um, it's one that's in development, and I am still waiting on study and consideration for a couple clades. I know it's going to be mostly dinosaur focused. Um, I have a pitch, Chimeran Witch Circus. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Um, there are probably there is a general current of Chimerans mistrusting and not liking witches, but that is not the case with the Kaleen and the Picardiant. And so witches among those people probably would um, form a entertainment avenue, as long as it's, the older witches are generally much more self-important and not likely to do that sort of thing. But I think a lot of the younger witches would, and certainly in the assembly, um, there are witches who uh, use magic in entertainment. Are there any major or minor First Children ruins outside of the peninsula, and what do they look like on the peninsula? Um, there are certainly First Children relics about. I know in the Lost Hellfighter I mentioned a a few ruins that they pass, both in the Inland Sea and in Picardia. Trying to remember if I've described them in other places, but oftentimes the construction that the First Children used would be organic. And so if the magic within that, primarily bamboo structure, still has its sunlight, it's probably going to still be around. And they did work with other materials, stone and brick and what have you. Um, but that is primarily what they were working with, is um, enchanted bamboo that they would plant, and it would grow in the structure that it was effectively programmed to grow in. Um, so I imagine a lot of the ruins could be mistaken for a weird plant growth. Um, but it depends on what era, because earlier in the First Children era was when they were mostly working with stone and clay and other more familiar materials, lumber, that sort of thing. And so it would depend. I do hope to eventually do an episode on the three eras of the First Children, and kind of the archaeology and the architectural hallmarks would be something that I would discuss. And the First Children early on, they would have probably the most enduring ruins, because this was when they were working with materials that tend to last longer than bamboo. Um, what Megaraptorans will you feature next in the Ballad series? My current plan is Bakar is this year, Kurojaku is next year, and Odotaku is the year after. And my sort of broad strokes idea is that the Bakara is going to cover some of what I want to cover in the Kurojaku. The Kurojaku is going to have an adult, a very older male as the protagonist. And so I'm in the interest of making sure that I cover some of their younger years. That's going to be covered in the Bakar episode. And then the Kurojaku story has him end in Picardia, and I thought that might be a fun jumping off point for the Odotaku in the year after. So that is my tentative plan, for those. Next year, this year is going to be the Bakar, which is a large Suchomimus inspired, long snouted Suchomimus inspired Megaraptoran in the Ceritic wetlands, which is right there. What is your interpretation of Mesozoic ground cover? I think Lycid and sorry, I almost said Lycid because I've been reading so much trilobite stuff. And mosses are underrated for paleo artists, but it seems that uh, ephedra species were also very present and looked like grass. Um, it's something that I have studied a fair bit, but not extensively or recently. Um, my understanding is that fern prairies were very common, um, and horsetails were also pretty abundant. And that's something that I've translated into my own presentation of here's what a world that may have not had the level of devastation and turnover that we saw at the end of the Cretaceous, although I know that there was still a general angiosperm turnover prior to that. But I'm trying to present Chimera as generally the idea of what it probably was like in much of the later Cretaceous. So there's still angiosperms present, and in some areas they make up a majority, but it's not as one sided as it is today. Um, so, what is my interpretation of Mesozoic ground cover? Um, I know a bit, but I'm hesitant to make any confident statements because again, I'm just a guy. Um, Why did you choose to have both a Permian continent and a set of Permian islands with the Dicynodonts and Therocephalian Cynodonts separated? Great question. I'll be completely honest. I don't remember the decision making behind that. These were both of those were concepts that were quite early on in development. Like first, Chimera was just Picardia. It was just an island in the Bermuda Triangle, and then it was an ambiguous. There's a couple islands in the Bermuda Triangle, and then it's a whole planet, and there's a bunch of areas beyond the known world. But I'm focusing on the known world. Um, I would say by college, there was definitely this idea that there are two different islands that have more Permian focus. Um, the Therocephalian dragons were going to be on one, and the marine Dicynodonts came from a different place that had a lot of Dicynodonts. Um, and the inspiration as for why these two groups kind of ruled each of their respective and separate areas. That was largely driven by my understanding of South America um, and Australia uh, throughout the Cenozoic. Was that generally speaking, there is a clade that radiates and becomes dominant. There are Therocephalians and Cynodonts on the Permian continent. There are probably going to be a couple really small Dicynodonts on the Permian Islands, but presently there aren't, and I might just stick to that. Um, it's just kind of an homage to what appears to be a general trend in ecosystems on Earth, where uh, in the aftermath of a big extinction, if there's um, in the aftermath of a big extinction, there is often a clade that tends to broad strokes dominate. Each of these continents has other clades that occupy various niches. Um, I did focus on the Therocephalians and the Dicynodonts because those are the prevalent clades, but both regions do have other animals that have occupied um, other regions. Um, how prevalent is neurodivergence in chimerans? Um, Probably very common for the simple reason that I I have a diagnosis of ADHD and autism, and that is something that I find often quite difficult to write characters that aren't some flavor of neurodivergence that's not any particular type of statement I'm making, just that like it's something that I tend to have an easier time portraying those characters, and so it's probably pretty prevalent. I would imagine not any more prevalent than it is with humans, but maybe it is. Maybe I'll tie that to magic somehow. I'm not entirely sure. It's not a conclusive statement that I'm making. Just it's a concept that I've debated. Um, what is the darkest part of Chimere? Probably the darkest part of Chimere would be the polar regions. At the moment, the axial tilt of the planet is comparable to Earth, maybe a little bit different, and so that might make some areas darker for longer or less. I haven't fully decided where I want the modern axial tilt to be exactly. Um, and then there's also some cavern ecosystems that I plan on exploring, so maybe that would count. I don't know. Are there any other large tyrannosaurs beside the Nihamu that have survived in Kyrule? Probably not, but I won't rule it out just yet. Um, I am pretty inclined to make the Nihamu the last of its kind, though. But it's I'm not sure yet. Would you open to be doing an episode on the diversity of airborne fauna in the first dynasty if sponsored, or is this something that you would come back to in a later year? I would certainly be open to it. Absolutely. Um, I remember there being mentions of making a wiki for Chimere. Has there been any update on that? I know that there is a fan wiki which has a tremendous amount of work put into it. I'm very impressed by it. Um, I would like to make one, but when I initially sat down to try to make it a couple years ago, I very quickly found out that it was something that I was going to need someone to help me with because the uh, software and platforms that I was looking into was not very user friendly. It's something that I would love to find good software for. I would really like to um, uh, get a platform in which I would not need to. Um, I want it to be clean. I don't want it to have ads. I know that the fandom wiki for Chimera out there has ads just by virtue of necessity, and fair enough. But that's something that I would like. Was I would rather pay extra to get a wiki that doesn't have any ads on it. Um, but it's a big undertaking that I haven't found the right software to dive into yet. Now that I've restructured my approach to the channel and only doing an episode every other week, I'm finding myself with more time, and that is on my agenda to look into after I have published my next book. Um, and it's my hope that I can um, explore that further. Um, got any ideas for that Chimera TTRPG you mentioned before? Yes, plenty, but again, it's something that I really want to have the project developed more before I dive into the RPG, because there's just going to be so much about the world building that I'm not ready for. Um, Also, it would be really nice to. I need to figure out if my books are going to be traditionally published or not. That is something that after this anthology, I'm going to polish up my draft of The Lost Hellfighter and start seeking an agent for it. If I traditionally publish, get an agent, and a publishing house takes the book, then it would be so much easier, I imagine, to make an RPG rather than having to try to do the whole thing myself. I could hire a team for it. Um, but that's presently on the back burner. It's something that I had started to make a bestiary for Chimere for 5e, but the program that I would have been uploading it to would have given copyright ownership, or at least partial to Wizards of the Coast if I published this thing, and I didn't want to do that. So I had to hold off until I can really understand the legality behind it and make sure that I'm not giving away copyright of Chimere. Especially, it ties into if I'm going to an agent or a publisher to publish my work, it is much easier for me to coordinate that if I'm the sole owner of the property. But if Wizards of the Coast has a disclaimer that lets them come in at the 11th hour, that would be frustrating, to say the least. So it's something that I'm holding off of. Are there any terrestrial sharks? None planned. Congrats on 15,000. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. What is the largest angiosperm rainforest in Chimere, given that most tropical forests are Titan gardens? I'm not sure yet. That may well be the Ushalek, but I'm not sure. Will you make a Belosaurs of Chimere video? It's not on the roster. No one has come forward to sponsor it. It's one of the many subjects that if no one sponsors it, I will make a video of it on my own eventually. It just hasn't gotten on the roster yet. I have rent to pay, so I must prioritize that which is funded. What are the benefits of importing life to Chimere for the portal? Initially, the instinct was presumably, because again, the assembly doesn't know. They're not allowed to study the portal. This is the lore around the portal is primarily their inferences based on what they have been told and what they have experienced going through it. But the assumption is that the benefit of importing life is that the instinct began when the portal was trying to make its territory lush. And so if there was an absence of something, it would send out a satellite, collect, and plant so that it had food, basically. And as it spread further and further, it reached out into the stars, took life from our planet, and replicated it on theirs. So it's food, presumably. Really more like an isekai, but also for dinosaurs. That basically, yes, I confess I don't. I have only a superficial understanding of what isekai is, but my understanding is that that basically describes what Chimere is. What is the function of the middle back limb in early ambuloichthyans? Was it always long enough to reach useful items from the ground? So my idea for them was that pretty quickly the lineage that we see today that has that long turning the dorsal lobed fin into a limb was that these were arboreal. And so it would help them climb around in trees. Probably pretty quickly became something to reach up and be useful. But I envision it early on, it was acting more like the tail of a is it spider monkeys that brachiate with the tail assistance? I believe it is. I could be wrong. So don't take that as gospel, please. Gosh. For 10 billion subscribers, you should kill every living thing on Chimere. If we got to that point, gosh, I mean, then I'd be set for life. I'd still keep working on Chimere. Who am I kidding? What inspired you to make the Carbosuchians? Mostly it was wanting to have one of these initial lineages that was still pretty basal. Not everything develops weird gimmicks. I think it makes sense for at least one of these clades to still be pretty basal stem tetrapod vibes. And so that was my inspiration for the Carbusikians, was uh, basically the equivalent of the everyman kind of trope of these clades. Um, has the portal ever harvested alien flora or fauna? Um, the organisms from other planets besides Earth have been harvested. Usually, they are brought over and perish. Um, Earth had the good fortune of being the first planet that the portal reached that was successful. Um, and then once it was successful, the portal stopped looking for other places. Still has satellites out there. The first children use them to access some of these other planets. Um, but the portal basically stopped once it found something that worked, and we had the good fortune of being the first thing that worked. Um, what are the potential other mythical, legendary, folkloric creatures of our world myths from various creatures you plan on making and displaying in Chimere? Um, mm, uh, I That's not really how I approach it, if that makes sense. Like I come to a region, I develop creatures, and if one of them reminds me of a mythical creature I've encountered, I'll give it the name. I think the only exception to that would be the dragons, where I went into it with the idea of wanting to make a dragon that had more mammalian qualities that would more evoke um, early bestiary art of dragons. But other than that, generally my approach is more like, for example, on the Permian Islands, as I was developing a group of predatory Dicynodons, I realized, oh, this is actually looking a fair bit like a griffin. Let's lean into it. Let's make peritons and hippogriffs as well. Um, so it's I don't have a mythical creature in mind that I'm trying to make a version of in Chimere. If I make a giant snake, I thought, oh, this could be Jormungandr. Um, for example, you could potentially make Lemias another, either on the Permian Island or continent, similar to the Lilith Commission for YouTube's Goji Center Hybrid Wars Fan Edition. Um, so that concept of a limbed serpent, probably I would go for more of a monitor lizard ancestor. But like, yeah, I could maybe explore something like that. That commission was a whole lot of fun. Um, and I'm looking forward to seeing how my client's submission does. That was a lot of joy to make. I don't really know a ton about the hybrid wars. I've seen some of Goji Center's videos, and I like what I've seen of the more speculative evolution stuff. I'm not a kaiju guy, I'm sorry to say. So a lot of that content is not really for me, but I like the Jurassic stuff that they explore there. Um, um, how do people rationalize going through the portal? Um, I mean, normally people are fine. It is not widely known how the process works. I have a little bit broken character when I'm explaining how the portal works, because I appreciate that people want to understand it. But in universe, again, the assembly is not able to study it. There's a lot of theoretical stuff, and they have gone through the portal, so they have some of their own experiences. Um, Technically, the assembly doesn't know that it's not a portal, and so that's, again, me breaking character a little bit, um, in explaining how some of this stuff works. Because generally, my channel, I'm trying to approach it as, here's what the assembly knows. That is the lens through which a lot of the lore is established. Um, And so for the average person going through the portal, they probably don't know that they have died and are a copy, if that makes sense. The people who do know um probably there's quite a few existential crises that occur, I imagine. Um I think some people might rationalize it as like, I think the turnover of cells in your body is every 7 or 8 years. Um, all of these cells in your body have died and been replaced. I don't know if that's actually true. That might just be one of those Snapple cap truthisms that, but the premise makes sense to me. Um, and so that I think that could be a way for you to rationalize it is like, this is as much me as I was 10 years ago, you know? So that might be a means by which people can compartmentalize and process what they just experienced. Can the portal create multiple copies of the original copy it made? Yes, absolutely. It can. Um, it does not, with the idea that um, I don't know. Again, uh, blurring the lines between my own world building and what the assembly knows. Um, I would imagine that the portal may have originally just made a ton of copies of things, and then it just made a ton of males, and so that's not a reproductive population, and so instead it collected a bunch of individuals trying to as closely replicate how animal populations operate. Um, as far as the assembly knows, there has never been multiple copies of something. There have been no glitches that are known to them. Um, so that's my more canon answer. Um, do any do you have any ambitions to spread out to other forms of media like games and shows in the future? I have no plans to it. I would certainly be open to it. I think shows. I think Chimera would probably be best translated as an animated show, other than instead of live action, for reasons I've dabbled with in the past. Um, but I don't have any plans for it. I think that would be very exciting, though. Um, have you ever thought of creating another speculative evolution project? No, honestly. I have made a project that has enough breadth that if I want to explore, the what if there was an entirely different track that life took in the Permian. I have two different land masses in Chimera that basically function as alternate future with some weird tweaks here and there, um, aspects of that. Um, but I don't really have any intention of creating another speculative evolution project. Other fantasy works, sure. I think that I love working on Chimera, but there is certainly something to be said for I enjoy playing in the sort of D&D world with more fantastical elements. That's not something I want to work in Chimera. I like the tone that Chimera has, but there are other projects that I enjoy working on, but I scratch that itch with the role playing groups that I'm in. I have a couple different groups. One that mostly meets every Monday, and that group we're very good about trying new systems. So I feel like if I'm feeling more sci-fi, we've played a couple science fiction games. We've played a couple high fantasy systems. So it I think my favorite system we've played is Savage Worlds, which I think is a bit more in the tone that Chimera sets of kind of generally lower magic, um, more grounded. But I think I scratched that itch that might drive me to create another speculative evolution project. Also, I've been working on this since I was 12, and it's nowhere near done. There's still so much work to do that I am excited to do. Um, so I know I don't feel a tremendous drive to start another project. Also, I just the way my mind works, if I try to do another project, the crossover confusion that I would experience. I know people who work on like 5 or 6, 7 different projects. My mind can't do that. I'm built different and not for that. That is not something I could execute. Why did you choose to have Earth life first come into Chimere in the Devonian rather than earlier or later? That's a great question. I, gun to my head, I don't remember. I think it is a convenient point to have that first dynasty, that first 100 million years of terrestrial life in Chimere feel very different. There was enough time where there could be several really distinct, weird alien clades that I could explore that I've only scratched the surface on how much I plan on developing them. Um, but why exactly did I do that? Again, I don't remember why that happened. I just had an amazing idea for a supervillain, Age of Witches, a witch that tampers with the portal to make it constantly print out themselves. They are a legion. They are many. That would be a lot of fun. I plan on having the Age of Witches have some people mess with the portal, and that is certainly a means by which that could be quite fun to explore. What is your favorite Chimeran animal? Again, I think it's got to be the Endrikai. Although Kurajaku and Uktan and now Zentar are they're all up there. Um, do you have a habitat natural history in mind for the Arctic continent? Yes, but it's all pretty early concept. I have not completed the execution on that development. Are there Australopithecines in Chimere? No, there are not. Um, how long does it take for skin changers to change into their animal form? Is there a way to explain the process? It'd be interesting to know in depth. That is something I'd love to do an episode on, but in brief, the length of time does vary quite a bit. Um, if you are turning into something that has the same mass as you, it can be pretty quick. Um, I envision it as kind of embryonic development inspired. When I first described Emahari transforming into an Indrakai, I described her as not losing mass, but like she basically regressed to the developmental common ancestor between a human and a bird. And but I probably am not going to go on to that level of depth. It's probably going to be a bit more narrow transition. um how long it takes, again, if you're the same mass, I've described it taking only a moment or two for Yumi in the second anthology, but her brother, who turns into the same species of walrus but being male, is much larger. It takes him several minutes. Um, so it depends on if you're just altering how your mass is composed, it's quick. If you need to draw in mass from the ground, from the ocean, um, that's a much more lengthy process. Um, can you please name the Chimeran animals that can be kept in zoos? Probably all of them could. Like you could make it work. I don't have a full list though. Um, do, 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 do. Which character have you written that you think is most analogous to yourself? Um, I mean, I think all of my characters have a little bit of me in them. Um, I that's just the approach that I have is how I relate to a character is if I can find a piece of them that I can relate to, um, that I can then build an experience from. I have been told by close friends who have read the anthology that Argonite is probably my closest self insert, if you will. And I didn't set out with that intention, but I can definitely see it. Um, what was the first animal you first fully designed for Chimere? I'd say that's probably got to be the Indrikai again. Um, was Therizinosaurus ever harvested? Um, there's probably either that or something similar. The harvest in Maastrichtian late Campanian Asia probably coincided with Therizinosaurus or something similar. So yeah, most likely. Aside from the Hueochituca, is the other Plantabelosaurs in the known world being converted to Noasaurs too? Most likely, yes. But I would need a dedicated episode to really think on that. Regarding the Intellidont riders of Kyrule, how intelligent are their steeds? Are these hell pigs as smart as parrots or dolphins? That's the plan. Is that they're quite intelligent, probably not so font level, but smart, and they can talk, which I think would be convenient for you and your mount and lead to some fun interactions. Do you ever see old designs for creatures and decide to reuse them as new animals? Yeah, quite a few times. Um, um, Titans start out pretty small, but if you would take one as a hatchling, would it be able to be tamed and able to be trained? Would it stay loyal as an adult, or would it just raid crops? Probably would be quite impractical to keep. They're smart for sauropods, but that's not saying much. Um, so I don't think so. I like the idea of a fantasy setting with dinosaurs and thought your take on it was really creative with how they continued existing since the arrival of Earth along with animals. Thank you very much. I definitely want to still have it feel fantasy, if that makes sense. Um, but at its core, I approach Chimere like a science fiction setting, even though I'm writing it as fantasy. Um, um, or the Dimetrodons, I don't believe Dimetrodon coincided with any harvests. Um, do you forget sometimes about the existence of certain animals in your world? Yes, absolutely. There have been a couple times where someone will bring up the name of one of Chimere's animal, and I will have to look it up. Uh, so yes, definitely. Um, what would it take for a Pantherine to evolve to the level of vassal predator? So it is my understanding that there is a likely a biomechanical limit to the size that cats can achieve, probably due to the structure of their paws. Um, and so it's probably impossible. The only way for maybe for it to do it would be something like Smilodon Populator, which is borderline redefining what it means to be a cat. Um, and so that might be an avenue. Um, but again, then it's getting into the size where it's heavily competing with theropods, and cats have such minimal endurance as a general rule that that would be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Um, who are the different people groups, both human and non-human, that have established populations in the assembly home base? I envision it is predominantly human, but there are some of each of the other uh, non-human sophonts in Agathanosis, Rooster Crest Island, which is there, right there. Um, um, Hello, I have a question. I noticed you made the Odanga similar to Goji, and I wanted to know, were you able to make any fictional creature in media and put it in Chimere? What would it be? Um, that's a tough one. I sometimes get inspiration to make something similar, but it's there isn't one that I have encountered that I want to and have been considering, if that makes sense. I'm not nothing really comes to mind. All right, I'm gonna now start to speed run through these. Um, will the Dragon Riders ever get to the mainland as mercenaries, raiders, or conquerors? Without spoiling anything, maybe. Do the Assembly have any contingency plans should Chimere be exposed to the wider Earth public? Yes. Um, are there any trolls still canon? Yes. Um, are ichthyosaurs still extant on Chimere? No, they are extinct. Out of all the continents in Chimere, most of the Australian animal in Chimere, there's a lot of kangaroos. That is my gut response. Um, um, are there any modern domesticated dogs analogs, or have there been any unique breeds? There are quite a few unique breeds, yes. I envision that some dogs in Chimere were imported, but for the most part, they are um, developed in Chimere. Um, what are the main real world inspirations for the Chimeran languages? None. I very much try to develop them independent, um, but I would not be surprised if there's some subconscious influence here and there. Um, are there any surviving allosaurs? I have a genus of Carcharodontosaurs uh, in Eastern Kyrule. Yes. Um, do you still have plans for your Volant spider concept? No, that one's gone. Um, I've ditched so many ideas. That one's not unique in being scrapped. It's part of why early on I didn't work with a lot of other people's concepts, because I would feel bad if I was collaborating and cut something. Um, and now for copyright reasons, it's just impractical to do anyway. Are there any Auks still extant on Chimere? None planned. Um, um, what is the strongest Earth country that a Chimeran country can defeat? None. None. None at all. How do you feel about fan fiction? I think it's great. Go off. Um, did any of the predators did any of the predator roaches from North American Asian forest of 66 million years ago make it to a modern setting? Um, no. Have the portal ever? Oh, already got that one. Um, would you be all right with me researching, making a list of all clade taxa options you could implement from the Cenozoic harvest? Like you'd need deer options from 1.5 million years ago. Yeah, absolutely. That's a tremendous ask of work. But yeah, if you were to make a pre-made list, that would be a great starting point. Absolutely. Have Doles and their close relatives ever been replicated in Chimere? Yes, and there's two species of Dole in the modern project, one in Arvel and one in Picardia. Will we get a Noasaur episode? None's been sponsored, but that'd be very cool. Metriacanthosaurus ever been in Chimere? Probably, but I don't have any definitive canon. How did you go about making the map of Chimere? It was a long project of many different developments. As for the one behind me here, that one was basically just a large version of the one I had already drawn for my book. And it's a nice thing. I usually write on the other side of my desk, so it's nice to look up and be able to estimate, long can a how long would it take for someone to sail from one region to the other. It's also just it's fun. I like it. It's inspirational. Keeps me going sometimes. Has the portal ever uh, are there any hotspot magma islands like Hawaii beyond the known world or main continent, something very remote with no land connection to the portal? If so, what might live there? Yes, absolutely. Most in the known world are not fitting this description, but yes, there are tons beyond the known world. Um, what would live there? Probably a mix of very small animals that floated over on rafts, your insects, tiny mammals, um, and then the uh, terrestrial versions of birds, maybe pterosaurs, um, terrestrial island pterosaurs is a whole other conversation that I think would be very interesting to have, but I'm trying to trim down here. Um, what cultures inspired the cultures of the known world? Um, Again, I try to avoid having any direct analogs, but there are a lot of inspirations in the form of, again, as I discussed earlier, kind of common denominators. Um, Picardia, for example, has a lot of inspiration from the Maori of New Zealand, of people in Japan, and people in the British Isles prior to Roman occupation. Um, so those are my main cultural inspirations for that particular region. Um, but I try to make them feel distinct. Um, what is your favorite time period in Chimere? Modern one, quite frankly. What is your favorite robust monarch? I mean, honestly, right now it's the Zentaur, but I think that's just because I just spent so much time with them. Um, is there any chance of the Dragonborn still surviving in Chimere? Um, the Dragonborn being a term for the skin changers who could take the form of a dragon prior to the Dragon Rider dynasty. Um, there's certainly a chance, yes. When you name creatures, you often give creatures relatively nice sounding names with very poetic translations. Um, do you draw from any real language in that way? No, I very much try to avoid real language inspirations when possible. Real language inspirations certainly come about in the form of um, the etymology behind a lot of the names for real animals in various languages. But I I want the languages in Chimera to feel distinct, largely because it sure would be weird if Latin independently developed both on Earth and Chimera, right? So that's kind of the mindset I have with trying to make distinct names. Um, in the latest Trilobite history episode, you mentioned the Permian dynasty of sea monsters. Could you elaborate? I do have an episode on that coming out sometime later this year. But in short, my idea was that as the planet became colder and more arid, um, that led to an increase in ocean productivity because generally nutrients are more mobile and productive in colder oceans. That's part of why um, the Pleistocene oceans were uh, proposed to be so productive here on Earth. Um, and that's something I kind of have plans to translate. And so it's called the Age of Sea Monsters because the lands were pretty depauperate, but the oceans were booming with all sorts of weird monsters that I am looking forward to designing. Were there any Chimeran cultures based on Indian cultures? India was quite influential with a lot of the Telmeid peoples, and so that would be kind of in this area, the Sarid, kind of northern, especially this area that is just outside of what I'm pointing to, what has a lot of um, Indian subcontinent inspiration. Um, if you had to choose, what would you say your favorite extinct animal is? It's got to be Spinosaurus. Um, if you had to choose, um, have you considered reusing the old design for the whale or shark, or at least the coloration, to represent subspecies or potentially separate ones? Probably not. I mean, I reused a lot of the basic design in the new one. You know, I try when I redesign, I try to keep some core elements, even if I'm updating the anatomy. Um, it doesn't always work, but I try. Um, all right. Do the Kaishel sauropods still give live birth? No. That lore has been stricken from the record. Um, um, could a skin changer take the form of the Picardian Indracos due to their being within the size range? Yes, absolutely. And indeed, there's a whole clan built around them that I will eventually expand upon. But yes, unofficially, yes, they have been, that has happened. Um, um, Thank you so much to the folks who have sent the super chats so far. I very much appreciate it. Um, oh goodness, I am so far behind. All right. Sorry, I just refreshed here. Does Chimere have any mythical monsters? You get that in a world like theirs, there's not as much need for make things up, but there are any weird monsters in folklore off the top of your head? Yes, absolutely. There are these humans are very imaginative, and we will often concoct strange stories because the monsters in Chimera that we see as weird to them are very mundane. And so I imagine the folklore of Chimera is filled with weird things that are not based on reality, just because people are creative and we make stuff up. Um, the one that first comes to mind is a entity in Siritic folklore which has elements of a dozen or so different creatures. It's called a dragon, and it kind of has this sort of Chinese dragon sort of inspiration to its design. That one's not a real creature, a real entity, but it's an important part of their folklore. Um, I'm really into Chimera on an animal and biology level, but I struggle with the human and non-human cultures and factions and countries. Is there a playlist for that? There is not, but that is something that I need to devote some time to, because that's kind of the beating heart of the anthologies. So I definitely need to expand upon that. Um, and I may well do a unsponsored "Here's the Peoples of Chimera" episode or series. I think that would be a good way to draw in new folks who might want to read the books, who might not know that that's even a part of the project. Um, um, Is the anything in the oceans that's weird that you haven't covered yet, like late surviving placoderms? No plans for surviving placoderms. The oceans of Chimere, the deep oceans in particular, is a project in and of itself that I'm very excited to start developing. Um, it's not on the immediate roster, but the a lot of what we are familiar with in our own world, the oceans, from my understanding, are largely fairly recent. Um, Now, is that because the combination of lanternfish creating this boom in biomass in kind of the lower sections of the oceans that allows for more of an ecosystem to build up there? Is that because whales perishing in the past 15 million years and sinking to the bottom has created an opportunity? Or was there a major extinction down there um, that caused this turnover? Don't really know. Um, Couple that with Chimere having a the portal has no reason to harvest from Earth's deep oceans. And so the deep oceans of Chimere is going to be an extremely weird area. Um, there may also be some major turnover. It might have been quite depauperate until cetaceans became a big part of Chimere, although there are also lots of um, marine reptiles that still would have been depositing corpses in ages past. So that might not be as much of a case as it was in the early Cenozoic. I'm not sure. Again, this is all this is basically a project in and of itself that I'm excited to dive into, but I haven't yet done more than some initial kind of assembling concepts. Um, have chimeras ever tried to tame or domesticate megaraptorans? Yes, and it's never worked. Um, who is the most powerful witch in Chimera's history? I don't know yet. I have not developed a tremendous amount about the Age of Witches, but it was probably someone back then. Um, there was a UFO in Arvel. There sure was, and that was one of the many first children research and acquisitions um, kind of vehicles that they would send collectors out theoretically. Um, have any newly posted research caused problems or hiccups in your world building? Absolutely. The one that comes to mind is shortly after I posted my Kaishel video, which had a polar sauropod. There was a study that came out, I think it was a few days later, going over um, the realities of sauropods being extremely depauperate in colder regions, with some ideas as to possibly why. And so that was definitely a difficulty that I uh, have rolled with. But again, the reasons why are still somewhat debated. I've heard a lot of compelling theories. I'm not aware of consensus on that. It's something I plan on looking into more. But yeah, no, there's absolutely been um, challenges, and there are also some times where I know that there is active research being done, but I'm not a paleontologist, nor do I want to break anyone's embargo. So I kind of have to make a decision and accept that it might well be proven wrong in the not too distant future. So it's certainly happened. Um, what made you so interested in Megaraptorans? Because they're also my favorite clade. I loved your Uktan saga. Thank you very much. What made me interested in them was that they were different. They appear to have, there is a general trend of a lot of sauropod, a lot of theropods, predatory dinosaurs, throughout the Cretaceous, especially increasingly investing in bite over arms. Now, in general, the anchor point for both your bite and your arms, if you're a theropod, is localized in the same space. There seems to have been a bit of a difficulty with over investing in both, and that's something that my quadrupedal theropods that I'm going to be exploring, that was their solution to that problem, was just bulk them both up, get big jaws and big arms. You just need to crawl forward. That'll be a whole fun side project to dig into. But that's what drew me to Megaraptorans, was they seem to have, while most theropods were investing more in their jaws, the Carcharodontosaurs, the Belosaurs, and the Tyrannosaurs, the Megaraptorans kept question mark asterisk generally more slender jaws and invested more in the arms. We don't have a complete skeleton of Maip, but it seems that from the shoulder anchoring point, they did not atrophy their arms. They were still, even as they were getting big, were still generally more arm invested. We don't know what Maip was doing with its skull. There's still a lot of questions surrounding that. We don't actually have the arms, so perhaps Maip was, had a lot of arm muscle, but was shrinking its arms. Again, we don't have this material. I am told that there is more material on some of these larger Megaraptorans in the works, but again, I don't know what the information it is, and even if I did, I would feel reticent talking about it, because it would be embargoed. But I don't actually know any of this, so it's a moot point. But yeah, so that's what appeals to me about Megaraptorans, is they are they were doing something very different from what most other predatory theropods were exploring throughout the Cretaceous, and I think that's really neat. Would the Kurajaku protagonist appear in the Bakar special as a teenager? Possibly. I won't rule it out, but generally with these things, I'm trying to prioritize what the story I'm telling is, and I don't want to shoehorn things in. And so if there's an organic way for that character to show up, maybe, but I would not want to approach it that way. I got 10 more minutes. I'm calling it at 3, so I'm gonna try to speed through these. I'm very sorry if I don't get to your question. It is my hope to do more of these in the coming months. And so if I didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. I will. Oh, hey, buddy. My cat Wesley here. Wesley, say hi. He's not interested. He doesn't want to say hi. He just wants to mess around on my desk. But yes, so I'm sorry if I don't get to your question today. It is something that please keep it in mind and ask it next time. And I will strive to do so. I was thinking today would be an hour. We're almost at hour 3. So again, I do want to get to them though. I'm not too familiar with Chimere, but I would like to say I love your Fabodonts. Thank you very much. They're weird. I love them. I love me a weird creature. Are the first children and their technology the source of UFO myths on Earth? That is, yes. That is kind of the lore that I'm playing with. I don't anticipate it explains all UFO sightings. I think the reality is that most of them are probably other things, but I like the idea that that's some of what's going on. Are there any other planets with life in Chimere's universe? And will you ever do episodes on them? There definitely are. It's not something that I currently have plans or intention of exploring. Thanks so much for doing the Q&A. Do you plan on elaborating more about the first children, perhaps a story told from their perspective? I have about, I think I have 4 stories that I've written that I probably will never publish on the First Children. At the moment, I think it is important for the narrative of the setting that there be a lot of mystery around them. But it is something that I am definitely open to exploring more after the novel series is done. I might do a whole anthology um, on the First Children again after the novel series is complete. So it's a very long term plan, but I'm definitely open to it. Thank you so much for making Megaraptorans a prominent part of your lore. They are my favorite clade, and I think they deserve more appreciation. Are there any Acrocanthosaurs, Siatch, or Conchovenator relatives in your lore? Thank you very much. As I mentioned with the Maip comment, I think Megaraptorans are very cool. Acrocanthosaurus, Siatz, or Conchovenator relatives. Again, I've got some Carcharodontosaurs that I would say are the closest relatives. So yes. Sorry, as I'm speed running, I'm now gonna try to get to the super chats here. Because we've got only a couple more minutes. How would the known world react to dragons, titan crows, monarchs, sunrise titans, and regular titans were to suddenly have competition? I think any major megafauna coming to the known world is going to really shake things up. It's part of why the known world um, has such a messy ecology, is because there's constantly new frustrating competition thrown into the works. And so that's a pretty major challenge to their ecosystem here. Um, um, Given Indrakai skin changers are meant to be gone, who was the Indrakai spirit in the first anthology? So that is something that I do plan on keeping kind of ambiguous. What the Indrakai spirit was in that story, is that her hallucination? Is it a was it a skin changer? Was it a swarm of magic that took on the appearance of something that she would identify as a friend? Um, Planning on keeping it ambiguous. Will he return? Yes, absolutely. You have not seen the last of the trickster god. Um, what is the animal that has gone through the most redesigns through the project's history? That I think would be the Weochituka, the Ceratosaur of Placardia's Highlands. I have designed it as any number of different Ceratosaurs as the idea behind its ancestry, but it's generally been consistently a armored, armless um, theropod of some sort. It's presently a Noasaur. I've dabbled with the idea of making it a late surviving Coelophosaur, but I've decided against it for reasons that I'll get to at some point. What is the largest animal in Chimera in general? I think that's the cachalot, the sperm whale. That is one of the kind of firm rules I plan on establishing Chimera, mostly just because I think it's kind of funny. If I'm being honest, that for all the giants of Chimera, nothing is as large as the largest animal on Earth. We still are going to have that title. I know that there has been people who have said that that's a frustrating trend in speculative evolution. I guess I'm not aware of it. I'm just basing it on my own understanding that blue whales got as big as they did because of the kind of unique context of the ice ages. And that's not present in Chimere. So not only does it not really make sense for a baleen whale in Chimere to achieve that size, I also just I like the idea that Earth still has the biggest animal. Um, how big can Fabodonts get, and where are they most common? I think they're probably most common in Kaishel. Um, in the Kaishel episode, I said that there's a lot of weird creatures in the interior, and one of those clays is the Fabodonts, and they can get pretty big. In the story that I am no longer publishing in this next anthology, but might be in the next one, I describe a Fabodont that's about bear-sized, um, and can rear up on its hind legs. Um, so they can get quite big, but I don't imagine they're ever gonna rival the largest mammals, much less dinosaurs. Um, um, I admit I tried to make a list of the animals in the Howsey Prairie based on these videos, but I'm sure I missed a few. I when I do the wiki, that is something I plan on making is um, kind of a what animals are in each biome. Um, but that's part of what is making the wiki such a large project that I need to devote a lot of time to before it would be ready. But I have started making. I have a lot of documents ready to kind of convert over to the wiki once it's ready. Um, will there be a video exploring the aeroplankton? Will you explore other interesting cases of mutualism and symbiosis? No, none planned at the moment, but that would certainly be something well worth exploring and something I would like to do. Um, what other elder gods exist in Chimere, like the Great Portal or Ushalek, and any details on the others? Right now, I've got two in kind of one of them in kind of this area of Arvel, and one in Nikar. Um, both of those, I envision as being kind of I present them in folklore as kind of siblings. They're both underground. They're both um, and that's something that they will be a focal point of one of the stories in the anthology. So I want to wait to give too many details on those twins until that story is ready, because it's still a bit in development and there are a couple kinks I need to work out. Um, there are a couple other ideas that I have, but again, and none of them are ready to present quite yet. So I'm sorry to say that they're not quite ready. Um, do the Oceanic Mock, Steward of the Abyss, and Zulanitok, are those now Carbosuchians? Yes, they are. The Steward of the Abyss and the Zolanitok are it's the same animal. Um, Zolanitok is the Akanuk word for the Steward of the Abyss. The Mock is, if I'm remembering correctly, an animal in uh, that one's in Kaishel, and that one's also going to be a Carbosuchian. Um, ooh, this might be a good one to send us off. If you could go back in time and change one decision you made while developing Chimere, which would it be? Oh boy. Um, this one may not be a good one to end on because I might not have a good, crisp answer for it. Um, I think probably the decision I would. I don't know. I mean, some it's hard. I don't think there's any. That's not a satisfying answer. I should end on a different one. Um, mm, what advice would you give to a Spec Evo starter? I my advice would be to focus on things that excite and engage you. At the end of the day, I think this should be something that you find rewarding to come back to. So if there's a ecosystem, if there's an animal that just hits it for you, that you just get very excited by, I would say focus on that. At the end of the day, that's going to give you a lot more endurance to fill out the other things that might not click for you. Um, I have gotten a lot of critique on Chimere that there's just too much of a focus on megafauna. I try to stress to people that I'm not trying to say that Chimere doesn't have a robust microfauna biota. That is just not something that really interests me. I like big things. I like dinosaurs and mammals. They're something that has captivated me since I was little. So that would be my advice. Would be to don't don't feel like you can't do things that excite you. That you can't focus on things that you enjoy, because you won't be taken seriously enough. I think if you want to dive into something like this, it should be something that you really love. So that is my advice to you. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for everyone who came here and posited questions. Real quick, I want to get to this one super chat. Any plans for the Tarrasque? The ones from medieval France is very different from D&D. Same for Behemoth, Leviathan, Questing Beast. So absolutely, it's a D&D icon, and so it's one that I've been familiar with, but it is not something that I have any plans for at the moment, but I would generally defer to how they are presented, not in D&D, but in folklore. I think because largely it's the assembly who are naming things. So they're naming these mythical creatures back in the 1700s, 1800s. So if they were going to call something a Tarrasque, it would be inspired by the Tarrasque from French folklore, I believe. But yeah, so that would be my answer to that. Was I don't have any plans for it, but if I did, it would be much more inspired by the creature in French folklore than it would be from Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you all so much for joining. I am blown away by the questions and excitement. It's very rewarding and just exciting. Thank you all so much for enjoying this project and bringing it to 15,000 subscribers. This is much more than I anticipated this channel would take off to, and this channel is the reason that I've been able to develop Chimere as much as I have. Prior to this channel, I was fitting in writing and drawing and concepts when I could between shifts at work and just generally being too tired to really throw myself into it. So the community that I have built here on YouTube has enabled me to really specialize in making this a strong project and to make a career out of this thing that I love. So I'm very thankful to all of you for making that possible, for all of these super chats and my Patreon patrons and everyone who donates their money to contributes their funds to making this something that I can focus all of my attention on. It's something that I couldn't do without your support. This is a exclusively community funded project. And I am so thankful that I'm in that position. And I'm also thankful to everyone who watches these videos, because even if you're not in a position to directly donate to Patreon or just send money directly through Venmo or any of these other things, supporting the project just by watching the ads really bulks up. I mean, I'm able to make most of my rent, if not all of it, purely based on the ad revenue from my YouTube channel, which is very exciting. So it's I thank you all so much for watching the ads and for making that so that that's a great way to support the project with that, even if you're not able to in a position to contribute funds directly. And so for all of those ways in which you all have supported me in the creation of this project, I am very thankful to all of you. Thank you so much. I hope you've had a lot of fun with this stream. I will hopefully get to all of these other questions in future live streams. So if I didn't get to your question, I'm very sorry. I will try to be more brief in my responses in future live streams to try to get to all of them. But again, thank you all so much for coming, for contributing your time to this, and your. I'm just so glad that I've made something that is so meaningful to so many people, and it's I'm so glad that this is something that I can devote my life to. And I couldn't do it without all of you. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day. Cheers, folks.